Hello, family and friends. In this past week, I have read a very, very interesting book. It's called Intended for Evil, the title of this video. It's written by Dr. Les Sillars, Sillars, a Canadian who teaches in the United States in Virginia at Patrick Henry College in journalism. He met a Cambodian young man who lived through the killing fields and has an incredible ministry today in Cambodia, and wrote his story, but it's a very well documented, he's a good journalist, well documented and very balanced political perspective in this book, Intended for Evil, a survivor's story of love, faith, and courage in the Cambodian killing fields. Now, that tells you whether or not you're interested in reading it, but let me just say, though it's somewhat morbid as to what happened to so many people, the way God protected this young man and how God directed this young man is really, really a worthwhile read. And a good reminder of how God brings good out of evil. What Satan intends for evil, God can turn into good. So let me summarize the story for you, not from the book per se, but from my own experiences in those areas. In 1974, I was the overseas program director at FEBC Manila, all the programs going outside the country at this time to other countries. The main focus for FEBC from the beginning in 1948 was China, and the second overseas primary focus was Indochina, which were the three countries of Southeast Asia continent, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. FEBC was building a new radio station on the northwest coast of the Philippines that would be a super-powered AM station aimed north at China and west toward Indochina, with incredible power across water, would be heard very clearly on the AM band. Until that point, all of our broadcasts to those countries from the Philippines were by shortwave radio, which still many, many people listened to in those days in those areas. My job was to make sure that the programs were ready for this superstation and the programmers. Now, we had some fabulous Vietnamese broadcasters living with us in Manila. Captain Quang and his wife Bic and daughter Nga, who was about Tim's age. Tim and Tanya played with Nga and other little kids on the compound from other countries. They were in charge of the Vietnamese broadcast. Captain Quang had been a chaplain in the South Vietnamese Army and was given leave to come to Manila for a number of years in order to be a broadcaster. He did the news, which he did really well and had many, many listeners, and other Christian programs. His wife Bic was a singer, and they were really, really popular people and great personalities for radio, and developed an incredibly significant listening audience. Now, helping them was another young couple who were there studying next door at the Bible college called Phoebus College of Bible, and also helping with the broadcasts in Vietnamese. Min and T were their names, with two little kids, and they did one program which was Learn English for Vietnamese people. Of course, remember, they had a lot of American soldiers in the country in those days because of the Civil War that was going on in Vietnam. And Diane and I were the English voices of that Learn English program, working with Min and T. Well, in 1974, our challenge was that Min and T and Captain Quang and Bic were planning to head back to Saigon. They had served their term, and they were having to go home to their home country. And they would continue doing broadcasts from there for the station, but not be available for live programming. So we needed to have more broadcasters to do live programming among us. So I made another major trip, which is what most of my trips were for in those days, monitoring how the shortwave programs were being heard and soliciting programmers to come live with us in Manila and do Christian radio programs. I went to Southeast Asia continent with the director for the region, who was based in Thailand, whose name was Leon Gold. Leon was a wonderful companion, a real man of God, and a real trooper. He had melanoma in his right leg, and his leg had swollen up like to the size of an elephant trunk, and he hobbled along on that leg. And he knew that this cancer was ultimately going to kill him, but he wasn't going to let it stop him in his ministry. And we traveled together, first to Saigon, where I met with Reverend Mieng, who was the head of the national church, which had been started by Christian Missionary Alliance. We were able to meet with Reverend Mieng, and he promised to send us people, or a person at least, who would be able to do live programming for us in Manila. From there we went to Phnom Penh, next door in Cambodia. Now, Cambodia has been embroiled in a civil war since 1970, when Lon Nol took over from Prince Sihanouk. And the missionaries there were having incredible opportunities, because during wartime, people are much more interested in spiritual things than in peaceful times, frankly. And so the church was growing significantly. There had only been a few hundred believers up to that point, but then things began to explode. We stayed with Norm and Marie Enns, who were Canadian missionaries with CMA. Norm was in charge of broadcasts that went out of the country, and therefore he was the liaison with me at FEBC in Manila. I stayed with them, wonderful people. And they briefed me well about what was happening in Cambodia. They took me to see the World Vision Hospital. World Vision had just built a beautiful children's hospital there, which ended up being an incredibly important ministry in the country. During the early 70s, one of their leaders, Stan Mooneyham, held 2 crusades in Phnom Penh, where thousands of people responded to the gospel. And so the church was growing very quickly. But the key person I met on that trip there, in my mind, was a young man named Son Son. Son Son worked for the Bible Society, but he had the gift of evangelism, and he had a passion for evangelism. And he'd be out every spare minute ministering to the thousands of people who were flocking into the city as refugees. See, the Khmer Rouge were fighting out in the countrysides, not in the capital. And these people who'd lose their homes in the Civil War would then just come into the capital trying to find a place to live. And so thousands of refugees were just flooding into the city. And they had nothing to do. And so Son Son would have meetings with them, whether it was a Bible study or a worship service or just a preaching point. He said he never shared the gospel with these groups of people, where hundreds of them came to faith in Jesus as a result of what he shared. And then he'd go back and have a discipleship class with all of these people, and he was just so excited about what God was doing in their country at that time. Well, the lead I got from Norm Enns was that there was a Cambodian gal who grew up as a pastor's daughter there, and she had gone to Vietnam, and I could meet her in Vietnam. I had just come from there, but I said, well, let's go back again, so it's on the way home. So we went back to Saigon, and there met a missionary who was with the Assemblies of God, and his name was Aaron Rothganger. At Aaron's home, we met Kim Nee, and she agreed to come to Manila to head our Cambodian broadcasts live. But while there, we met some very other interesting people. There were 2 young men who were Filipino missionaries to Vietnam during the war era. One was Celso Samido, and I didn't know it at the time, but Celso had fallen in love with Kim Nee, and later we would arrange their marriage in Manila. And today they live in Texas, and they pastor today. But I met them there at Aaron Rothganger's home. Now, also visiting Aaron at that time were a young couple from Cambodia. They were Americans named Todd and Deanne Burke. They were grads, young, just recent grads of Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, and they had had an incredible ministry in Cambodia during those years of the war, and hundreds of people coming to faith in Jesus. When they were forced to leave the country later, Todd wrote a book called Anointed for Burial, which has become a classic from the era. Well, they were interesting people we met there. A year goes by. Kim Nee has come to Manila. She started heading up the Cambodian broadcast, and we're getting into April of 1975, and the wars in Indochina are not going well. The Khmer Rouge were gaining ground in the countrysides of Cambodia. Well, in April of 1975, Sun Sun, the young man who I was so impressed with from the Bible Society, had gone to the church leaders and said, I really feel that I need some leadership training, and I would like to go to Manila, and I've been invited by FEBC to come live there and do some broadcasting with Kim Nee, and then go to school at Phoebus College of Bible next door. It would be ideal for me and my family, and the church leaders agreed that Sun Sun should do this. And so they were able to get very difficult to acquire visas to leave the country. I mean, imagine living in a country where it's harder to get out than it is to get in. But they were able to get those permits to leave. And they had their tickets booked for April the 15th to fly from Phnom Penh to Manila. And we had everything ready. Diane was compound hostess. We had a home set aside for them. Diane had it all furnished, and everything was ready for a family. The Sun Sun and his wife had 5 children, and all 7 of them were going to come live with us in Manila. Well, the plan was for April 15th, but on April 14th, the Khmer Rouge bombed the airport in Phnom Penh, and all international flights, in fact all flights, were canceled from that day onward. It was only 3 days later, on April 17, that the Khmer Rouge marched into the city of Phnom Penh and took over. And from then on began an era which have notoriously been known as the Killing Fields era. It was a very sad, sad time in the history of this country. And Sun Sun and his family were stuck in the capital at the time of the takeover, not able to get out as had been planned. And we were so sorry to hear that. Meanwhile, next door in Vietnam, things were not going very well in the war there either. And the Viet Cong were getting closer and closer to Saigon, and it looked like it was soon going to end. So Carl Lawrence, our program director for all of FEBC, went to Saigon and talked with the American embassy people and asked them if they were willing to bring our 2 couples, the Quangs and the Ts, out of the country if and when they left. And he had set up a coded message with the Quangs and Ts that we would send to them on the day when they would be rescued and taken from the country, because it was felt they would be at high risk staying there under a communist regime after what they had been doing in broadcasting and being South Vietnamese supporters. Well, April 28th, Carl came to Jack Baker and me. He said, we have a coded message you need to build into your program. You're supposed to really do this in broadcasting, but this is life and death. So please tell your story and build this into it. Well, every morning on morning coffee that Jack and I did, mostly for young people, lots of missionaries listened as well, and other people who were interested and understood English throughout Southeast Asia. Well, I would share a story of Charlie Brown and Lucy and Linus from the Peanuts cartoons that Charles Schulz wrote. I had books and books of little clips and quips. There were so many funny ones, and I would share one every day. Well, on this day, we made up our own Charlie Brown story. And the message was, Charlie Brown says, he looked out the window today and the grass is green, the sky is blue, the sun is shining. It's a beautiful day. Be prepared for a beautiful day. Well, that was the coded message for the Quangs and the Ts, to know that they needed to get ready, that the embassy people would be coming by in their cars and picking up their family and taking them to the airport, and they would be flown out of the country to safety. And of course, that's exactly what happened on April 28. And on April 30th, it all ended in Vietnam. The Americans pulled out for the last time, and the North Vietnamese took over the entire country. The Quangs and Ts made it to safety. They came through Manila. They stopped at Clark Air Base, and we went up to visit them. It was great to see them safe and sound. And they then went to California, where they continued to do their programming for Vietnam, but from a U.S. base and from the main office there in California. Another family that happened to be out of the country from Cambodia at the time it fell, Lim Chung was his name. He had a Chinese background, but a Cambodian citizen and speaker. And he and his wife and kids came, and they lived in the home that we had prepared for Sun Sun. And he and his family helped Kim Ni and others in the Cambodian broadcasts on DWRF, the new superstation, as well as the shortwave going into Cambodia through all of those years. Well, during this time, thousands and thousands of Cambodians tried to escape the country, and most of them tried to go to Thailand on the west. It was a horror story how many of them were killed trying to do this, but literally hundreds of thousands of refugees ended up in Thailand from Cambodia. And of course, again, when you're in a refugee camp, what do you do all day? There's nowhere you can work. The young man in our story was able to do some ministry things. But one of the men who was there was an incredibly gifted artist and sculptor. And one of the things that both Jim and I have noticed in our travels is that people who have experienced trauma often express their relief from the trauma through art, whether it's kids drawing pictures or telling stories, or in this case, it was carving an incredible piece of artistic work. And through Kim Ni and Salso, I was given this piece of art that he had drawn, or he had carved. And this is a carving out of stone. I mean, this is really heavy. And it's two Khmer Rouge killing a Christian on his knees. He'd already dug a hole behind where he's sitting, and he's there. This is carved out of jade stone, and it's very heavy. It's a morbid subject, but it is a masterful piece of art. And it has been one of my treasures to have as symbolic of the persecuted church, and how Satan thought that he was going to win through this horrible evil. But I've kept this carving as a keepsake for the rest of my life. Well, in 1984, this would be 10 years after the fall, basically, of Vietnam and Cambodia. I was now living in Singapore with Open Doors, and I was able to go with 3 colleagues to visit Vietnam and Cambodia. And the reason was that Vietnam had taken over Cambodia in 1979 after 4 years of these horrible killing fields. Even they decided that this had gone on long enough, and so they moved in and drove Pol Pot into the forests, and for the rest of his life he was basically isolated out in the jungles until he finally died. But with them in control, it allowed tourism to resume in both countries. So Tom Corbett, who lives in Nova Scotia today, was a colleague in Manila, Open Doors, and Pete Barotilla and another young Filipino brother named Ver who worked in Thailand with Open Doors. The four of us went to Vietnam and Cambodia. We met with Pastor Mieng again, the leader at the time, who is now with the Lord, but at that time he was the leader of the evangelical church that the CMA had established in the country. And we asked him how things were, and he said, well, it's like Romans 8, and he quoted the verse in Romans 8 that said, we are like sheep being led to the slaughter. That was the verse of Romans 8, and yet if you read the next verse after that, it says, yes, but in all these things we are more than conquerors. And it was a beautiful time we had with Reverend Mieng. As we went to Cambodia, to the next door country, the first time after the terrible killing fields era, we learned that Son Son and his family had all been killed during that terrible, terrible period, and that some of the bones we saw in the piles of bones that they showed us of the horrors of the Khmer Rouge were his family's bones. And we remembered him. And in my book, at the next decade, I was to write my first book called Secrets to Spiritual Success, about the persecuted church. And in the last chapter, I tell the story of Son Son, who was to come to Manila, and the day before he came, the airport was bombed. And in my book, I say, I long for the day when I will meet Son Son in heaven and hear from him how God used him in those last days of his life. He was an amazing guy. And I know that God had some reason for his staying in Cambodia and not coming to Manila with us. Well, only one pastor of all the pastors in Cambodia survived the killing fields. And in 1979, when the Vietnamese took over, he came back to Phnom Penh, the capital, and they began having secret church meetings, which later became approved to be public, and the church became a large growing church again. Meanwhile, in Manila, Kim Ni and Celso get married, and it was a wonderful celebration. He had returned after, at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, and they met another couple there that were the same, a Filipino man married to a Cambodian woman who had escaped the country and come back to the Philippines as well. Her name was Samuel, his name was Robledo, and they came to visit Kimni and Celso, and Kimni and Celso led them to faith in Jesus. Samuel was a quick learner, and she became a really good disciple of Jesus, and also a very good broadcaster. So she began helping Kim Ni with broadcasts as well, and Robledo was a mechanic, and he fixed all of our vehicles for us on the compound at that time. But I share about them because later she felt called to go back to Phnom Penh when things began to open later in the 80s and 90s. And she established a FM Christian radio station in Phnom Penh, which is still there today and still broadcasting the gospel to a growing church. Both the church in Vietnam and the church in Cambodia have had significant growth since those horrible days, which simply, for me, goes to prove that Satan intended it for evil, but God turned it into good.